Hi all, today let's see how we can build a dynamic form using Angular. Dynamic forms are forms which do not have a predefined structure but are highly dynamic based on business requirements. These kinds of forms are based on metadata such that the metadata has a predefined structure but the content which is generated from the metadata will be highly flexible. So this will be particularly useful in applications which deal with a large amount of forms. Now let's see an example of a sample metadata which can be used for generating forms. So here we have a JSON file called meta.json. If you go inside this, you can see there is a list and within this there are different objects. This file consists of the information or the metadata regarding the controls which are present within a form. So the main identifier for a control is the key called control type. So here I have given control type as the name. You can give any name, and based on this particular key value pair, the type of the control within the form will be decided. So this is a mandatory field within the metadata. So here you can see that the metadata, even though the content changes, follows a similar pattern. Based on this pattern, we will be able to create dynamic forms. For generating dynamic forms, the reactive form is the preferred way because it is highly scalable and easily flexible for testing. So now, based on this particular metadata which we saw, let's try to categorize the components. So here, as you can see, there are different control types. One is a drop down, other is a label, text input, and a checkbox. So based on this control type, we are first going to create reusable components. So in our Angular 13 application, since we are making use of reactive forms, first let us import the reactive forms module. So once it is imported, we will be able to access the reactive form within our components. Based on the meta.json, first we will create an interface. So in this case, I have created an interface called control base. So within this, as you can see, there is a control type, which is a mandatory field, which will define the type of the control. So here it is defined the control type of type string. Similarly, we have a field called order, which is a number, which can be used for ordering the controls. So based on the number which we have given in the control, the order of the controls within the form can be adjusted. So that is also defined within our interface. Now coming to these two keys. Key is the key which defines what is the name of the data binding. So here you can see that the meta information does not hold any actual data value of the forms. The actual data is coming from a different source, that is the data.json. The key will be representing the name of the field in the data JSON which will have the corresponding data. So for example, in this initial drop down, the value for this particular drop down comes from this country key. So initial value is set as USA. So once this drop down is rendered, based on this key, that initial value will be populated in the drop down. As you can see, particular key will be present only for controls which actually bind data. So the controls which can actually bind data here are drop down, checkbox, and input. Whereas the label will not have that particular key because it does not bind any data. It only contains the text. Here we have defined the key, which is a string, because it will be bound to the form control name. Similarly, we have the required field. So this is also optional. In case that particular control is required, we can mark it as required. In case it is not needed, we can omit it from our metadata. So here in this example, you can see that the first name is required and the last name is required, whereas all the other controls do not have the required field. So first we define the control base. Now based on this control base, first let us create a text input. So first let us take a look at the text input component, which is a reusable control within our dynamic form. So the equivalent of this control is the text input control type. So whenever this control type text input comes, we will be rendering this text input component. So here there are basically two inputs. One is the metadata itself, and you can see that the type of the metadata is the control base which we saw earlier. And we have a second input called the form. So now if you go to the HTML, the metadata which is based on this control base. So here we are assigning the key to an ID and the type is text by default. Other than that, we have the form control name, which is ideally the value or the form control to which we will be binding the actual data. We have the name of the control within the key. We are assigning the meta.key to our form control name. So one thing to note is that whenever we give a form control name within a component, we need to give a form group here. So in case we didn't give a form group here, it will throw an error. Now in order to give that, we need a form. So this particular form will be created outside our reusable component, and that is why we are passing it inside as a input. So once we have created the text input component, we can add this within the declaration for our app module. So here I am importing the text input component, and now those errors which we saw earlier, they would have gone away. Now similarly we have a drop down component. So here I have defined a separate interface for the drop down control, because the drop down will contain an additional key called options, which will basically be the options which we see while clicking the drop down. So here it is a key value pair. Now this also extends the control base, so it will have all the keys which we saw earlier. Let's go to the drop down component HTML. So here again the structure is quite similar. We have the form group which we saw earlier. Since we make use of the form control name, we need to have a form group. And if you go to the TS, you can see that the inputs are similar, the meta and the form that are passed within the drop-down component. And within the meta, we have the key, which is bound to the ID as well as the form control name. Also here, the extra thing is that we have an option, which is a list, and we are making use of the ng4 directive and looping through the meta.options, which will have the key value pair for the options. So once we have defined this, again we can go to the app module and add the drop down component. So the errors again are gone. Now we have the checkbox control. So here again we are extending the control base and we are adding an extra key called label. So it is basically the label for the checkbox so that we can identify the purpose of the checkbox. Again, the HTML is quite similar. We have the form group and the input form, and we have the input type checkbox. Again, we have the metadata where we use the key for the name, form control name, everything. And here for the label, we make use of the property called label, which we added here in the checkbox control. So now again we will go to the app module and let's add the checkbox. So now we have one last control, that is the label control. So one difference between the label control and the other controls is that the label control does not bind data to the particular control. It is basically consists of a text. So here what I have done is I have created a separate interface called label control, and here I am omitting the required field as well as the key field from the control base, because the label, since it is not a control, we cannot mark it as required or we cannot bind data. Other than these two keys, we need only the order and the control type. So for that, I have created a separate interface and I have added the text property, which will be the value of the label. If you go to the label control, it's a simple label tag with a metadata information. The text within the metadata is bound to that particular label. So if you go inside, you can see that the input consists of only the meta. The form is not needed because it does not bind to a particular data. So now that we have created the reusable components which are going to be used within our application, now let's start to get the actual data and the meta which is residing on a different server. So here the data and meta JSON I have created in a separate folder, and I am hosting it on a port localhost 8080. So now in our main application, we need to fetch this data. So for that, I have created a service, that is the metadata service, the meta service and the data service. So in the meta service, what we are doing is we are fetching the meta.json. After fetching, I am just sorting the data within that meta JSON based on the order. So this is how we will be ordering the controls based on the order key within the items. Within the app component, initially we will be calling the refresh method, within which we will be getting the metadata as well as the data. So data service also, it is similar. It is just getting the data.json. So once we fetch both these information within our app component, what we are doing is we are passing that data to within a new component called the app dynamic form. So it has two inputs. One is the meta and the other is the data. Also here we are ensuring that unless the meta and the data are defined, we do not start rendering this particular dynamic form. Here in the app component, we have a button which can be used for refreshing. So what the refresh method does is it basically fetches the data as well as the meta from our hosted server. Now let's go to the dynamic form component which we saw within our app component HTML. So here if you go, you can see that it has two inputs. One is the meta and other is the data. So once it receives the meta and data, we are implementing the on changes so that whenever either of these meta or data changes, we will be running that through our meta service to form group. So this is the place we will be dynamically creating our reactive form. So based on the controls, that is the meta, what we are doing is we loop through each of that control so that in case that control is not a label. So in case it is a label, we do not need to create a entry within our reactive form. Only we need to create the form controls for checkbox, text input and the drop down. So in case the control is any of that particular types, we create a group, that's an object, and within that object we create a key which we will be binding to the form control name of our form control. Here we are checking that whether it is required. In case it is required, we will be adding a validator as a second parameter to the form control. So in the first parameter, we will be setting the default value, which will be fetched from the data. So as I mentioned earlier, based on the key, we will be fetching the data from within our data object. In case it is there, we will assign that value or we will assign an empty value. And since the required flag is on, we will be adding validator for here. And in the second option, we won't be adding any validator. So once we have created this object, we create a form group based on this particular group object. So once that is done, we are returning that form group to the form property. Now if you go to the HTML, this is the component where we are actually creating the form, and we are assigning a form group to the dynamic form group which we created earlier through this particular method. Now within this we have a for loop which is basically looping through the meta information. So our meta information, as you saw, it is a list. So we will be looping through this using the ng-for. So inside this, we have a component called the app control, which we will be taking a look now, which will accept a control, that is the meta, and the form which we created. So we saw that within our reusable component, we needed to have a form group. So for that particular reason, we need to pass the form which we created here to all our children components. So once we do that, here we have a submit button which is based on the validity. So in case the form is invalid, it will be disabled, otherwise it will be enabled. And here we are displaying the value of our current form. So now let's go to the app control and see what it contains. So as I mentioned earlier, it has two inputs, that is the control, which is a single entry of this meta JSON. So this particular entry is a control, this is a control. So similarly, there are multiple controls, and that we are passing to this control component. And if we go to the HTML, here we decide based on the control type which reusable component we need to display. Based on the control type key within the control, here we have a ng switch, and the ng case values, if in case it is a label, we represent the app label and we pass the meta information. In case it is a text input, we render an app text input and we pass the meta as well as the form. So form is required because we actually bind data to these controls. In the case of label, we do not need the form. Similarly, we have the app dropdown for the type dropdown and app checkbox for the type checkbox. The reusable components, as we already saw, are ready. Now let's restart our application. Now let's go to our application, and here you can see that based on the metadata which we have provided, a form has been rendered. Now let's see the real advantage of using the dynamic forms. So let's open both the windows side by side. So here I am opening the meta JSON. So based on this metadata, we are actually rendering this form. So one advantage of using the metadata based forms is that we need not modify anything within our code. In case I need to modify a field within this form, for example, let's try the different types. So here I am going to remove this label, that is a country. So that will be this particular label. Now in case I remove that and press the refresh button, you can see that immediately that label is removed without making any code change. The only thing you need to change is within the metadata. So we need not rebuild our application or anything. Similarly, here in case of text input, this is the first name. I am going to change the control type. So currently, as you can see, the first name is a input text box. Now I am going to change it to a checkbox. So now here you can see that immediately it got changed to a checkbox. So based on the order key, we can change the order of this particular controls. So here I am going to just swap the order of the label and the text input. Now if you see, the order has been toggled. Similarly, in case we need to remove the validity. So here we have a required validation. So now you can see that this is actually a required field. So in case I remove this validation from within the JSON, once you refresh here and delete, you can see that now it is no longer a required field. Similarly, we can also make use of the data JSON. So data, as you know, it will be saved in a separate source. So here initially you can see the data is selecting the USA. Now in case I change to India and refresh, now you can see that immediately that particular data gets bound to this drop down. So that is bound based on this particular key. That will be the same for the data and the meta. Similarly, in case I need to add a new option for this drop down. So currently I have only 3 options. Now I am going to add a new country and I press refresh. Now you can see that actually a new country has been added within our drop down. So this is the main advantage of using dynamic forms, and here we are making use of reactive forms since they are easily scalable. Hope you are able to get a clear understanding about how we can create dynamic forms in Angular and also the advantages of using dynamic forms. See you soon. Thank you.